Greetings, everyone. My name is Amy Banks, and I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar, Developing High-Quality School Emergency Operations Plans, an Overview. This webinar is hosted by the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Safe and Healthy Students in collaboration with the Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools, or REMS Technical Assistance Center, and in conjunction with the American Federation of School Administrators. Before we get started, we are honored to be joined by a very special guest, Diane Woodard, President of the American Federation of School Administrators, representing principals, assistant principals, and other leaders throughout the nation's public schools. President Woodard has 36 years of experience in education, has a bachelor's degree from Michigan State University, as well as a master's degree, and an educational specialist degree from Wayne State University. Welcome, Ms. Woodard.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Amy, for the kind introduction. Also, thank you to the AFSA members and all others who have joined us for today's critical webinar on school safety. I would also like to thank Secretary Arne Duncan, the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Safe and Healthy Schools, and the Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools Technical Assistance Center for partnering with AFSA to offer this very important webinar. As principals, assistant principals, and leaders in their schools, there is perhaps nothing more important to AFSA members than providing their students and staff with a safe and secure learning environment. Unfortunately, there have been several recent events that have made this very clear, including the horrific storm in Oklahoma and the school shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. In Newtown, it was AFSA member Don Hawksburn, the principal of Sandy Hook, who exemplified this commitment to safety by giving the ultimate sacrifice to protect her students. Not only was she an innovator and leader in her school community, she fought until the bitter end to do what was best for the children of her school, including assailing an armed assassin in the hopes of saving her students' lives. We cannot allow Dawn's death or the death of any other member of the Sandy Hook community result in anything less than taking immediate steps to improve the practices, standards, and training essential for student safety. School administrators across the nation opened their school doors immediately following the Sandy Hook shooting and continue to do so every day. Yet too many districts do not have comprehensive plans in place to deal with such emergency situations. We knew very well that Congress would not swiftly enact school safety legislation, especially once it was tied to the converse issue of gun control. That is why we thank the Department of Education for recognizing this urgent need, for meeting, communicating, and keeping in ongoing contact with AFSA, and for working so diligently to update its trainings so that the principals in charge of keeping children safe are informed with the necessary emergency practices at the national, state, and local levels. As the 2013-2014 school year approaches, we hope today's webinar helps you all in preparing for the year ahead and in your ongoing efforts to make your schools as safe as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Woodard. We appreciate your willingness to join us today. Appreciate your remarks and insights on this important topic. Now, I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues from the REMS TA Center. Todd?
Thank you, Amy. Today, Mr. Ahmed Negron-Perez of the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Safe and Healthy Students, will present our webinar. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Our call today is set so that only our presenters can speak to the group. However, we will be taking questions from the audience. To ask a question, simply type and submit your questions at any time during the webinar using the online Q&A chat function on your computer screen. The submitted questions are only visible to the webinar hosts and presenters. Please note that you will not be able to see the questions other participants are asking. Our presenter will respond to questions during the Q&A session at the end of the training in the order they are received and as time permits. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Ahmed Negron-Perez, who is a program specialist with the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Safe and Healthy Students at the U.S. Department of Education. Ahmed was part of the team that assisted with the development of the new guides and has been conducting on-site trainings and webinars with REMS for several years. He is a former secondary school principal and science teacher with over 14 years of experience. Welcome, Ahmed.
Thank you. I'd like to also thank everyone that's attending today and participating in this webinar, because I know how busy schedule is in the upcoming school year, and everybody's getting on track to get their schools up to pace and all the scheduling, and I really appreciate you taking this time out that we could talk and basically discuss this important topic of emergency operations plans, and to see how we can sort of look at it through a different lens and utilizing this guide. I'm going to flip back to the first slide once more, because what I basically want to talk to you today is I'm going to be walking you through the guide for developing the high-quality school emergency operations plan. And if you notice on the bottom of this page that you're looking at, we have the 6 agencies that were actually involved in putting this together. And we really like to thank this cooperation between these federal agencies, because it truly was a collaboration amongst all of them, and also a sharing of ideas and a creation of common language, which is very important, and you're going to hear that throughout this entire process. Sort of giving you an introduction of the purpose with why we do this, we acknowledge that, of course, each school day, we have approximately 50 million elementary school and secondary school students, in attending schools, and that we know that one of the main topics is to keep these families and communities, the expectancy of having these kids safe and also, one of the most important things that we talk about is the macro view, is that we base this not just from theories, but actually from lessons learned that highlight, how important it is to have this emergency operations plan and have everybody on board, not just school, but your first responders and also your community partners, which leads us to emphasizing a lot, and throughout this guide you're going to see that it's important that you sort of not just do this and shelf it, but that you revise, that you let this guide your efforts, and that you continually come back and compare this plan and process throughout what's already outlined here. If we look at the actual guide, you're going to notice that it's organized into 4 major sections. We're going to talk about the principles of school emergency management and what we're basing this philosophy, this new process, because this guide is a process that'll, walk you through creating these high-quality plans. And how you can talk to your community partners. We're also discussing what it's going to look like, the form and the function, and what the actual guides will look like and the actual plans will look like for that particular school. Also, a point to notice is that these EOPs sometimes might have even variations for the same school, but different buildings. As we know, many schools out there have more than one building. So it's not a cookie-cutter approach as far as you can apply it to everyone, but it is customizable for each individual school. And then, of course, the last section that you'll notice in this guide is a closer look, which is literally that, a closer look at key topics that sort of stand on their own and merit to be looked at a little more detail. And that's exactly also we're going to emphasize a little bit more on the school climate one. as I know the audience has a particular interest in that. Giving you the macro view, giving you how this all came to happen. The Presidential Policy Directive, PPD-8, basically describes a new approach to or towards national preparedness. And it defines this preparedness into 5 key missions: prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. So as a macro way of looking at it, we see that when we're talking about prevention, and again, this is goes towards everybody starting off speaking the same language, is to, as far as prevention is concerned, is to deter, to avoid, to sort of get out of the way of the actual threat or a mass casualty incident. When you're talking about protection, which the second mission, you're talking about how do you keep the schools secure? How do you sort of focus on certain things that will protect the students, not to use the same word, sorry, students, teachers, staff, and visitors. The next mission we talk about, of course, is mitigation. And you notice that mitigation is to eliminate or reduce the loss of life and property. So these terms, which of course are really familiar to everyone who's been dealing with schools and stuff, it's basically what we're saying that this guide is going to be sort of talking around and based upon. The last two, which basically everybody deals with consistently, is the response, which is the action of actually you're in the process of responding to your emergency, and of course the recovery, which is that capability that you need to sort of get back to restoring that teaching and learning environment. And those of us that are in the educational field know that this period in this mission is actually very expansive. I mean, it could be weeks, months, years. So there's a lot that we can talk about that, and we will once we get to that section. Okay, so speaking about planning principles and what we're talking about as far as how we're basing our planning procedures as far as going through this guide, you'll see that the first thing, and it's kind of highlighted there, is that it must be supported by leadership. Very important because you do need that support in order to get documents signed, in order to get permission, in order to get resources allocated. You do need that collaboration with that leadership. And I know sometimes it's boots on the ground people and get the things moving, but you still need that person that person to be able to move things forward and get everybody else on board. Of course, the next thing we talk about in our principles is that we're going to be using assessments to customize plans to the building level. So we're talking about not just basically on concepts and theories and what we perceive to be what's going to be effective as a plan, but actually basing them on assessments and gathering data from your school, from your building, from your local area, and then use that uniqueness and those circumstances to then start planning your emergency operations plan. And of course, as we always say, planning considers all threats and hazards, and we take an all hazards approach. It's not that we expect or that we suggest that each school write down all possible scenarios and all possible threats and address them all, but that they are capable of doing a holistic approach, and that they do consider all major threats. And throughout the process, you'll see that this comprehensive school emergency management planning is going to be talking about all threats. And also, I believe, and this is one of the opinions that I see as going through this guide, is that the guide sort of promotes the revisiting, promotes the checking of one step before we move to the next. And that sort of builds in that mindset of being able to address hazards as they come up. about what encompasses that children's environment. You're talking not just a school, faculty, and staff, but you're also talking about what's around him. We're talking about what are the functional needs of those students. We're talking about the culture and climate. We're talking about the diverse backgrounds, ethnicity, language skills. We have a lot of ESL students. And all these things you start considering as far as the functional needs that that community is in. Of course, another principle we have is settings and times. You're talking about when events and hazards and threats would happen. Also, some schools have a greater outreach program. They also have activities during their off-school hours, like they might have people visiting their campuses, i.e. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, extra band practice. Things to consider when you're in the planning process of creating your EOP. And then, of course, it needs to be done, and you're probably going to hear me say this a lot, that it has to be a collaborative process. You have to consider inviting your community partners. And of course, these are all suggestions that we're saying that if you follow this, you're going to end up with a high quality emergency operations plan. So it's a strong suggestion, and again, you're going to hear it a lot, that we need to include our partners, our community partners, because not only do they give you that perspective that you might not be thinking about, it also helps with crossing jurisdictions. It also helps with getting on board with a bunch of the different activities that you need to happen in order to have an effective emergency operations plan. So there's many ways that I guess you could come up with an EOP, and there's probably many ways out there. What we're saying is that in order for it to be effective school emergency operations plan, that we suggest this planning process, that we suggest that it's critical that you get your community in, that you talk to your local emergency managers, that you talk to your first responders, your mental health officials, and so on and so on and so forth. All those people that have access to or are affected by a threat and or a hazard. So as we look to initiate this planning process, you'll see that it's very linearly set up. But by no means are we saying that it's a step 1 through step 6 process. That we're saying that once you're done with step 6, you're done. You put it away and you lock it up. Well, no, we're not saying that. What we're saying is this is a good way to start. It's a good way to flow through, and it's a good way to wrap it around and come back and revisit. This process can be used and has been used for many other aspects. I mean, planning events, planning activities, and of course, creating a high-quality emergency operations plan. So we're going to be going by each step and talking about the different criteria and the different sort of characteristics of these things. A good practice is also, if you already have a school emergency operations plan, to sort of take that plan and walk it through these steps. And by doing that, you'll be able to see sort of like what's missing and sort of apply this thought process, this framework to actually what you already have in existence. If you don't have a current emergency operations plan for your school, this would be the perfect way also to start it up and get from the ground level. So let's start with step 1, which is always a good place to start. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to identify a core planning team. And this core planning team should be, and like it says right there, small enough where you're going to be effective, because we all know if you have too many chefs, the pot doesn't cook as good. But also you want it large enough that you'll be able to get these perspectives, these points of view that you might not be considering. You also want it big enough to include pretty much everybody that's going to have an effect or is affected by a response, a threat, a hazard. You want to talk about forming a common framework, which means know your strategies, know your vocabulary, know who the chain of, or what the chain of communication is going to be, know who is going to report, if you're going to break up your group into smaller groups, know how to do this, and talk about that before you actually start planning, and have that well coordinated, because then communication is just going to flow so much easier. The next step we're going to do is, of course, define and assign roles and responsibilities. One thing I always tend to mention in this section is that you sort of want to assign a role because of a characteristic, because of that responsibility, not necessarily associated with a title. Sometimes they do get associated with the title because, of course, if we go back from the beginning that you want some administrative support and leadership support, some positions have to. But it's also good to consider character traits and the actual role that you're going to have on the team, best fitted to the person. And of course, this is something that that we always kind of tend to put aside, is that sometimes we feel that since what we're doing is really important, and it is, that meetings are just going to happen because everybody's going to want to meet. Everybody's going to want to get together, and they're going to have that special thought saying, we haven't met in a while. Let's do a meeting. When the reality is, we're all busy with a lot of other aspects of teaching and learning, that it sometimes slips our mind, which is why we strongly suggest that you determine a regularly scheduled set of meetings. Far apart enough where you have enough people to produce, goals and reach some outcomes and get some deliverables if that's what you're doing, but regular enough that it becomes a habit. Of course, you can customize and add meetings or take away meetings, but it's always important to establish that culture, that team is going to meet on a regular basis. Now, something that you'll notice throughout these steps and that I really like about the guide is that before you go from one step to another, the guide will actually ask you or state, as we see in the second bullet, that after completing step one, the school has formed a planning team with representatives, and it reads on and so forth. What the guide is actually sort of training you to think about is before you go to the next step, this is what you should have accomplished. This is what you should have completed before you move on. And it's really important to make sure that your step is completed before you go to the next one, because if not, it just builds. Those gaps build as you go through the process. So I really like this about that guide. Okay, so we're going to step two, because we have completed and we met and we have all those objectives and stuff. So now we're going to identify threats and hazards. And of course, the identification of threats and hazards is it's going to sort of understand what can be or what can affect the school and the surrounding area, of course. So this is the sort of the part of the plan of the guide where it's sort of like a brainstorming session. It's like everybody's talking, and it's going to mention what threats and hazards we have that affect the school, that could possibly affect the school. So, you list them and you talk about them, and everybody's mentioning them. Now, the next step is where you're going to take, and then inside those threats and hazards, you're going to start assessing the risk that those threats and hazards that have been identified pose to the school. And we're going to talk about a little system, a little table that we have, that some assessments that we do that will help you throughout this process. So the key thing is also that once these assessments are done, they're not just done for this step. They'll actually help you when you come back to revisit, when you come back to revise, because again, that's the theme of this, producing a high-quality emergency operations plan. And something that I tend to say a lot is that the plan that you create today is never going to be as good as the plan that you're going to create tomorrow. And if you keep thinking that, you keep moving forward, you keep revisiting, you will always get better in what you do. So these assessments that we're going to be talking about, which are examples of assessments, and they're probably more at your local level that you can come up with, will sort of serve as not only the beginning parts of your EOP, it'll also serve as a tool when you come back to look at them. Okay, so the first type of assessment we're going to be talking about, and this actual table is actually found in the guide, And you can sort of look at it this way, and by no means am I saying you need to just copy and paste it, because that's not what we're talking about, but we are talking about that you can look at the type of assessment, and we're utilizing site assessment at this point, and we give a bit of a description of it, and then why are we doing and what you expect the outcome of that assessment to be. So when you're talking about a site assessment, you're talking about what are you going to examine. You're going to examine the safety, accessibility, and emergency preparedness of the school's buildings and ground. You're talking about facilities. You're talking about structures. But you're also talking about the area that is around the buildings. You're talking about accessibility. You're talking about are you able to either go in or go out of this area with certain disabilities? Are there other needs that need to be addressed? Access from EMS, access from law enforcement agencies. Are they able to get to where they need to get and be an effective, response? So these are the types of descriptions that you would incorporate into this assessment. Then, of course, why are we doing this? Well, you're going to increase the understanding. You're going to increase, how these impacts and threats are going to affect your site, where you're vulnerable. You're going to understand this better. And then, of course, you're going to know, are my areas accessible, by students and with certain disabilities, certain aspects, quantity of students, how many people are going to get in and out of this building, of this area. And of course, always, and it's towards the bottom, that you need to make sure that when you're doing these assessments that you're in compliance with your local laws and regulations, something that's always key. The next one we're going to talk about, type of assessment, is culture and climate assessment. Sometimes it's kind of sad to say that this type of assessment sort of doesn't get as much priority as it should, and it's definitely my opinion and what I've lived through as being a former principal, and that sometimes we get bogged down with the other types of assessments. Not to say that the other ones aren't important, but when we look at the culture and climate, we see that what you're going to find out when you do this assessment is how far-reaching your culture and climate of your school is, and how many different areas it does affect. Because we all know that with positive climates, the student will actually, feel a better sense of belonging, will actually even appreciate the learning, learn better, and even actually step up and bullying incidents by improving your culture and climate and that sense of belonging. You'll see that change will happen in a bunch of different areas. One thing to note, and that's good that it's in there, is that when you are doing a culture and climate assessment, you want to make sure that student privacy is protected. You want to make sure that the reporting, the gathering of this data, you take that into consideration, because that is very much part of the culture and climate environment. Moving on. The next assessment that we talk about is the school threat assessment. And the school threat assessment is, of course, you're going to analyze the communications and the behaviors to determine whether or not, a person may pose a threat. One key aspect of this is that these assessments must be based on fact, and you got to comply, of course, with all your privacy and civil rights and other applicable laws for your local area, and that while your planning team may include the creation of assessment team in its plan, it's not really, part of this, but you could also, have them meet on their own schedule. The next assessment is the capacity assessment, and it's exactly that. It's an assessment of what do you have at your disposal to respond or to deal with a threat and or hazard as it's happening or after that it occurred. This is not only talking about your physical capacity as far as your logistics, as far as your structures, but also your skills, good example that we have here, of course, is your first aid certification, your search and rescue trainings. You have personnel on campus that has this training because of their personal interest. Do you have a collection of this information so that it's ready available? And if you don't have personnel with these specific skills, would you have people interested in acquiring these skills? So that inventory of not just equipment and supplies, but also of the individuals with their skills and also actually their special needs could actually assist you when you start creating this plan. In fact, we suggest that it does. So after you sort of conducted these assessments and the planning team sits down and starts to try to format how I get all this information, all this data that I've acquired from not just these four, but any additional assessments that you feel your school would need. Well, what do we start? What do we start to? How do we start to weed through this data? Well, we sort of use variables, the concept of variables. Let's add some variables to this, and the ones we suggest are probability and frequency, magnitude, time available to warn staff, the duration, and of course the follow-on cascading effects of this threat. So if you can visualize, what we're going to do is you're going to take that hazard, you're going to run it through these variables, assigning certain levels to help you come up with sort of prioritizing these hazards as between a scale of like high, medium, and low. And so we sort of start assigning and prioritizing these effects. And basically, this is a sort of breakout chart that can actually also be found on the guide, where, for example, we'll pick fire. And we assign these variables with different numerical, order when you're talking about highly likely, likely, possible, unlikely, and as you move along through the magnitude and warning. And you can actually take simple mathematical process and run each hazard through this chart. And let's say a suggestion, I don't know, would be if you would say a high risk priority would be maybe from 15 to 20, and then from 8 to 14 would be a medium. Anything lower than an 8 would be a low. And like I said, this is a suggestion, that's something. But what this does is, since we started the process of identifying hazards and threats, you basically got everybody's input, and because everybody has their own perspective on what's top priority. Then you did an assessment to sort of validate and get the data behind these suggested or these identified threats and hazards. And then you took that and applied them through or ran them through these four variables, and that there could be more if it's at your local level, but these are the ones we suggest to help you sort of quantify and help identify those hazards that are in high or medium. So after doing this, you're going to have sort of a starting point, a focus point on which hazards and threats should be included very quickly into your EOP. And again, if you notice at the bottom of the slide, it says after completing, and this is basically from the guide, after completing step 2, the planning team has prioritized high, medium, low list of threats, and based on the results of the risk assessment. This is, again, the guide sort of asking you and letting you know this is where you're supposed to be at. If for some reason you have not reached that point where you have them all prioritized and you have the list, then by no means continue to step 3. Go back and again revisit, which is the theme for the day, revisiting. So now we go to step 3. So once we're in step 3 of this process, you see that the planning team is now sort of at a critical decision point. They're going to decide which of the threats and hazards are going to be addressed. And we suggest that you sort of start off with the high risk and maybe the medium highs, because you do want to get the most bang for your buck. You want to get the most, cost to benefit ratio. And that's definitely according to the data that you yourself collected sort of points to. And then once you have this, then you move forward. So you start assigning goals and objectives for each of those hazards that you've addressed as a high-risk priority or a medium to high-risk priority. I call this the rule of three. It's the rules of three, where the planning team, we suggest take 3 goals for each of the hazards. And those 3 goals are basically broken down into 3 aspects of an emergency response. You have the before, during, and after. So again, by calling it the rule of threes, saying that you take, for example, fire, and actually the guide has 2 examples. So you can actually go into the guide and they talk about fire, and there's another one that you can utilize as well. And by no means are we saying that fire is the most predominant one or is the most high risk. It's the one that's just chosen to illustrate this process. So we look at fire, and we say that 3 goals that we want to do, because goals, as we know, are overarching, non-specific. They're bird's eye view, and we want to say that one goal would be prevent a fire from occurring on school grounds. Another goal would be protect all persons from injury and property, and the other one would provide necessary medical attention to those in need. So as you see, these goals are not really specific, because that's when we start talking about objectives. And I know most people outside the education field sort of use interchangeably the words goals and objectives, but educators, we know that there's a clear distinction. And when we're talking about objectives, we're talking about objectives that are specific, that are measurable, and that you sort of know if you've successfully completed that goal. For example, we all know the student upon completion of this course will be able to, and we fill in that blank. Those are objectives that we have for that part of the teaching, that lesson plan. So as we're talking about objectives, we notice that the team has compiled them, has labeled these threats, and they will find and determine critical function or activity, things to do, things that happen. And they're going to apply to more than one threat. And that's what eventually we're going to talk about, I guess, cross-cutting functions, where a good example would be where you have this action point, this action that actually can be used in different hazards or for different hazards. Example I use, and I guess I'm going to go a little sidetrack here, but the example I use is cooking. And I want to make eggs Benedict. And egg Benedict is my goal. It's my hazard. It's what I want to accomplish, what I want to resolve. But in order to do that, there's several tasks that have to be done. There's several action points that have, or functions that need to be done. You need to poach. You need to create a hollandaise sauce, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, those functions can work for something else, because I could poach an egg for something else. I could make a hollandaise sauce for something else. Well, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about functions, and how where do you put these functions, or where can I sort of locate these functions? And that's eventually what we're going to talk about when we talk about the functional annex. As far as language is concerned, some localities and some agencies use appendix, because I know some states use that as their word for something separate from the plan. Well, I mean, and that's fine. We use functional annex. And that would be the place where these functions, pardon the redundancy, would be placed. And within that school's EOP, where you can then sort of look at them individually and try to address for that particular hazard. So, summarizing, again, the guide does a really good job of sort of hashing out that thought process of, after completing step 3, you have at least 3 goals, of course addressing before, during, after for each threat and function, as well as objectives for each goals. So again, following that rule of 3, you have 3 goals broken down into 3 aspects of before, during, and after, for objectives for each of those goals. And once you have that, and you're sure you have it, then we move on to step 4. And in step 4, this is the point at which you are going to start actually developing these courses of action. This is the decisive point. This is sort of after you've addressed all those tricky questions, after you've gathered your data and you have all this information. This is the decisive point when creating your EOP where you're going to actually talk about your courses of action. You're going to talk about the what, who, where, and when, why, and how for each of those threats and hazards and functions, and actually put those into place. To stress, yet again, this is really important to have established that collaboration between your community partners. Because in this part, when you're actually talking about your courses of action, if you haven't done so, it just makes it incrementally hard or difficult for you to proceed with what you need to do and have other people assist. So if you get them collaborating earlier in that beginning planning process, then the expectations from your EMS, from your fire, from your law enforcement agencies, from your mental health, from your school, faculty and staff, all speak in the same language. So now that you're addressing what needs to be done, then it'll be a lot easier as far as implementing these action steps. And of course, the course of action, it's going to include sort of a criteria of when the response will be established and under what circumstances, and how you're going to sort of address these procedures. Okay, one thing that we emphasize a lot, and I really like this word, is that when you're doing these action plans or these courses of actions, that you sort of pick 4 steps, and we suggest these steps. You could have more, but these are the steps that we pick. And that first one it's very descriptive. I like the word scenario because you depict the scenario. You talk about what it looks like. What is it going to look like? I have a supervisor who, when we present an idea to him or an initiative, he always says, okay, what does it look like? What is it going to look like when you're done? What does it look like? And that's really important because it sort of invites different points of view, because it's not just a blanket statement. It's to talk to me about the scenario. So then after you do that, you can determine, well, okay, so the amount of time that I have to respond, this course of action, is it stretched out? Is it immediate? Do I need to involve more people quickly or less people slowly? So it is a part determining that window of action. Also, the next one is identify decision points. And that's really distinctive in this, that you need to sort of talk about beforehand, before establishing that course of action, the points of which that person that is involved in that response, where in that response is there a point to make a choice? Stay, go, up, down, low, high, because it's not as simple as just saying, for example, stop, drop, and roll. There's no thought process there. You stop, drop, and you roll. In some responses, there are points where, according to what that person sees or what they assess, where are they going to go? What are they going to do? And that's important to discuss it beforehand. And then, of course, you develop the course of action, which encompasses, all the points that we discussed earlier. So you select the course of action, and in doing so, you start comparing what we said, what we want to accomplish, and we compare those to those goals and objectives that we established earlier. And we sort of start having that conversation of, well, am I going to continue to move forward with this? Or are we talking about that there might be some other way of doing so? And don't be afraid to say, well, actually, it looks a lot like this other course of action that I can incorporate it to, or actually one that I thought would go together, now it's different. And that, of course, is very much dependent on your locality and your specific needs. So, and that's what we talk about as far as identifying the requirements and matching the resources to these requirements. And you'll see that you can only work with what you have. So sometimes some of the course of actions require more input, more resources than others. And something to consider actually, before you end up with the plan. Again, if you look at the bottom of this slide, we're emphasizing once more that after you complete step 4, you should have identified your goals, objectives, courses of action for before, during, after for those threats that you've given the high priority or medium to high priority, and as well as functions that incorporate into that goal and hazards and threats. So you're talking about what actions, what functions can sort of be generic enough that can be placed into this hazard. Okay, so now we're on step 5. Moving along to step 5. In step 5, you're talking about taking those courses of action and that communication with community partners and talking about sharing this plan and with everybody involved, but knowing how much to share and what the actual plan is going to look like. So when we're talking about the different components of the plan, let's talk about the format. And the format that we suggest is a format that I believe not only will help you place the different sections in a sort of a logical order in the EOP, but I think it also lets somebody that wasn't involved in the process be able to sort of look through the eyes of that planning team, what they were thinking when they put it together. And I think that's one of the key aspects that we have with this guide, that by following this suggested structure, not only do you just give the data, you also give that sense of, oh, this is what they were thinking, this is what they were looking at. And the more you revisit, the more clearer that perception becomes. So that's what we're saying, including, the plain language, the visual, the visual, the picture, and all those things that could give it that flavor. And we are talking about 3 basic sections inside this format, which is the plan, the functional annexes or appendix, if that's what you use at your state, and then we talk about threat and hazard specific annexes, just sort of like a subdivision of that functional annex that is more specific to a certain hazard that is very, I have to say the word again, specific to your locality in your school district or your school. So we're talking about writing the plan. This is where you start talking about the draft, the tables, the charts, and the planning team sort of takes this and to everybody that sort of has an input on it, because that way you get that different perspective. You get that different way of looking at it from people that have varied experiences. And of course, you're going to review the plan. Very important that when you're reviewing this plan, you take into consideration compliance with the applicable laws, because you need to make sure you follow this, because as you go along through the process, the more you do, the easier and the more backing you're going to get. And of course, after the plan is approved, because it needs to be approved, because remember, if we revisit and we went all the way back to our first step, which was including, the proper level of authority on this plan and getting that leadership involved, it would make this process in step 5 a lot easier. And that's why we suggest that from the beginning. Also, one thing to note in that second bullet is that you want to share your plan with as many people as are affected by it, but also you want to make sure that those that are not authorized to see it don't have access to it. So this is a place where you want to be judicial in thinking about, how do I share it, what format it is in, the format that I share this plan with, and something to keep in mind. And then, of course, after completing step 5, the planning team will have a final school EOP. Okay, so, and if you don't, that's when you stay there. And that step, if you notice, is probably a step that will last and take the longest, in the sense that you have a lot of people looking at it. So what do? So I have this EOP. So step 6 is sort of about that, making it into a living document, making it into something that you can work with, making it into something that you use. And of course, anytime we're talking about that, you're talking about training, and you're talking about everybody involved needs to know their role. not just in the response, but also what we're doing before, what we're going to do after that emergency has occurred. And that's sort of getting everybody on the same page of what they need to do, but also equally important, I would say, that they know what the others are doing, because confidence in training builds confidence in performance, and that's something we all know. And of course, what is this training, what is it going to include? Something that we tend to forget sometimes that I've noticed is that we hold meetings after we have trainings. We hold meetings sometimes, even during. Something's happening and we're doing a practice and we sort of have a little meeting. It's really important to kind of hold that meeting before, too, because you need to talk about what's going to happen, who needs to be involved. Is this training going to be a training that it's going to be all-encompassing and may not be specific? And that's something you want to hash out before. Another key thing is visit the evacuation sites, because the evacuation sites, as we all know, are not located on your campus. They're a place apart where you're going to take your students, faculty, and staff to. And sometimes we have those listed and we have those worked out, but we haven't visited them in a while. And what we thought was maybe a 2-lane road to get there now over the years has become a 4. That all these policies and these procedures and these steps are sort of talked about, and it's written down, and you post them around campus or throughout the building of places to go, places not to go, and you start everybody speaking that same language. And familiarize everybody involved, not just students and faculty and staff, but your community partners as well, as far as what skills do I need in order to keep doing what I need to do. And the more you talk about it, the more you'll be able to identify those skills. And of course, now we're talking about what I call the fun part, because you're going to exercise the plan. You're going to actually get out there and do something. You're actually going to get them involved. And this is really something that there's been some discussion on frequency of practicing. Does that relate to, either re-traumatization or no? And what we've noticed and what we found out is that, and what we know is that the more you practice, the actually more at ease a response becomes. And I want to emphasize that word, response, because we want to move our stakeholders. We want to move them from a reaction to a response, because a reaction sort of implies that you're just, as the word says, you're just reacting. With a response, there's an assessment. There's you know what's happening. You recognize the situation, and you sort of activate all this learning that you have. So you do want to create that muscle memory as far as what I need to do, but you also want to respond to your emergency and sort of be well in tune with all the aspects of what that entails. And you're talking about that this exercise program, as it says in the last sentence, which I think is really important, sort of builds upon itself. You want to go from simple to more complex, from isolated to more involved. So you're going from a tabletop to more advanced exercise, to a full functional exercise, to maybe incorporating your community partners. I mean, how amazing it would be to have your fire department show up and practice actually rolling out the hoses and extractions, and all that thing builds on itself. Don't something that we suggest that you probably not do on your first exercise, but something that you build up to. And of course, as we mentioned continually throughout this guide, you review and you revise. And if you haven't noticed, at the end of each step, we sort of say that because this is what it's all about. This is where you close the loop. This is where you sort of come back to it. What worked, what didn't work, what could work better. What should we continue to do, what should maybe not do as frequently. And this is where you ensure that communication with everybody that's involved, that you are sharing the same purpose, the same theme, but also that everybody has been up to date to all the changes that have happened, because as I said before, this EOP is never going to be as good as your next EOP. So you got to make sure that everybody has the next EOP and is working off the same script. So step 5 of the, sorry. So when we're talking about the plan, we're talking about what this plan is going to basically going to look like. And as far as its sections, its chapters, its tabs, or the way we suggest that it should be broken down to. Because again, I think it emphasizes not just the data and the information that's in there, but sort of the thought process behind it. And of course, this basic plan, it's going to address, the activities, and it's going to address the different contexts and the different sections. We suggest that you start with like introductory material, which can sort of send the message that, hey, I have been in contact with my community partners, and it gives them a place to actually be mentioned and be part in it, and assists in that buy-in, because they'll see that they're there, that their information is there, that their name is there, and it sort of gives that whole sense of community as far as everyone was involved in creating this plan. It's not just a school thinking by itself, or an EMS thinking by itself. It's the community, and that's kind of the good place to put that. And then we suggest, of course, that you get a cover page, signature page, which again sort of gives you that sense of who's actually involved with this, and so on. A good place, the section that we talk about later after that, is the purpose, and sort of that overarching view of what do you expect for this to happen, and then the situation overview, which sort of explain why you need this, sort of a needs assessment type thing. We then move on to the concept of operation. Again, we're talking about, these are like little sections, little chapters, tabs inside the plan, which will give you that school administrator's intent and sort of that supervisory position of what this operation is to entail. And then, of course, we suggest the organization assignment of responsibilities. There we're talking about what the roles of those people that you mentioned before, and those agencies or personnel or community partners you mentioned before, what their role is going to be. And of course we're talking broadly, but we're talking about, so everybody that reads this sort of knows what role they play, but also what role somebody else with some other community partner plays. Then, of course, we have the direction, control, coordination section, which is the framework for all these activities and coordination of activities, and how they're going to occur. You have the actual information collection aspect of it, sort of like how this activity, how it applies to before, during, and after the emergency, and where that analysis came from. And then you're going to talk about, another section would be, of course, your training and exercises. What activities are you going to do to help you achieve, that proper high-quality EOP? And in this place is where you're going to put the trainings that you're going to have to ensure that everybody's on board, that knows what they need to do. So it's all about them flowing into each other, what we talked about earlier, as far as that progression from the simple to complex, from the isolated to the overarching. So you are talking about from a basic tabletop to a more advanced, to probably a drill, and so on and so forth, and the training that would encompass getting those things in order. Of course, another important section that we've mentioned is that administration, finance, and logistics, because you need to know and establish where all these things are going to be allocated to, or how they're going to be allocated to as far as funds, and also how you're going to talk about what policies do you have in existence that support this, or what policies are needed, or what procedures need to be established in order for you to be able to execute, this emergency response, and all these activities that you've mentioned earlier in the training and exercise section. And of course, a good place to put it, because since we preach it a lot, and since the guide actually emphasizes it a lot about revisiting and sort of going over your aspects again, and talking about this, it's the plan development and maintenance section. So it's actually suggested that you place this inside your plan, sort of built in, that yes, we need to keep maintaining this. We need to keep upkeep on it. And then, of course, the authorities and reference sections, so you could cite your specific laws that need to be addressed in your locality, et cetera. Um, talking about the functional annex content, and it's what we talked about. I know it's kind of talking about what we mentioned as far as my whole expansion scenario, but it's the part where you're going to have these courses of action, and they're going to be in there and described in a way that they can be done and then can be applied to the various different hazards. For example, if we were to talk about an evacuation annex, which is kind of straightforward, it's like, what do I need to do to get, evacuate my school and buildings, get everybody, get my kids and my faculty and staff outside the building and outside the grounds. This can be applied to various hazards, which is what the greatness or what I like about this functional annex. It's something I can go to and look at. Okay, I need to get my kids off campus. This is what I need to do. I need to lock down. How do I lock down? This is the course of action that sort of stands independent of the hazard, but that points you in what I need to do. And when we talk about lockdown actions, we are talking about, it's like a threat or violence around the school, and the objective, of course, is to ensure that everybody's safe. This is slightly different from, let's say, a shelter-in-place annex, where you still want to stay in place, but you're sort of talking about isolation. You're talking about a room that needs to be sealed from something from the outside. A key example, chemical, biological hazard, or even a tornado. You need to be in a shelter without windows. And so these two different annexes, though they talk about staying in place, it is a little bit different, and it applies to various different hazards. Of course, another commonly used patients. We know that schools need to communicate with their parents, with the community partners all the time. So if you have this built into your EOP, it sort of aids and assists in that process. And of course, the distinction between communications and sort of a warning communication. So you're talking about how you do both. How does this affect your internal audience and your external audience? Another one that we mentioned, and of course these lists of functional annexes are one that we suggest that you incorporate into EOP. You could have more. We recommend that you do not have less, because these are the ones that we find are universally important. Of course, family reunification, how you can reunite your students with your families or guardians. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be during an emergency, but it's good to have that action because you can apply it to different hazards and different situations throughout the school year. Another key one that we think is very important is COOP Annex, your continuity of operations, because this is a training onto itself. This is something that you must really look at if you're a school administrator, if you're part of this team, because it needs to be established. You need to know, how do I continue to maintain my same functions, my same essential functions after, during and after this emergency. I mean, not just talking about that teaching learning environment. I'm talking about the logistics, the getting your teachers paid, the purchasing of supplies, and I'm now going to have my grades someplace else. What about my, those lesson plans and so on and so forth? It's something that really needs to be discussed and have. We also have the recovery annex. We suggest, of course, you have that, and if that, in my opinion, can even broken down into like sub-annexes if you want, because academic recovery, physical recovery, fiscal recovery, psychological and emotional recovery could be a world unto itself. So this is something that we find it's really, really important that you should have. And of course, sort of feeds into the public health, medical and mental health annex, because you are talking about not just the regulation side of it, but also talking about this continuing counseling, which feeds into your recovery, and also the services that can be provided by medical health and public, and how that affects the different policies, and of course, all our FERPA stuff and HIPAA stuff that we need to comply with. And then you have, of course, the security annex, which is you're talking about, developing something that's routine, but you're talking about criminal threats to school. You're talking about something that happens either both inside or outside, and how you're going to react to that, and how is that going to be as far as building things that are physically secure, when we're talking about crime prevention through environmental design, but you're also talking about, what you expect your law enforcement to do. What's that agreement that you need to have with them? Um, threat and hazard specific annexes, it takes those threats and hazards and sort of goes down to a little more detail. So remember we started off with this 5 mission statement from the PPDA, and now we're going down to the specifics. And this is where, we sort of break it down to where either during, or after, where you might take some annexes and sort of subdivide them. And again, all this is in the guide, and you're going to have this available if you haven't downloaded it already, where you can read it in detail and sort of expand on this. A good way of listing this is you'll see like we have the different threats and hazards sort of identified, and you break them down into examples of each, not saying that these are the only examples, but that you can break them down and sort of categorize them and develop them as you need in your school. And then we go to the last section, which, as it means, it's a closer look. And we talk about we picked information sharing, psychological first aid, school and climate, and active shooter situations. We picked these because we figure these are sort of like universally important. These are the ones that you should at least take a closer look at. You can, of course, there's more that you could take a closer look at, but these are the ones that we recommend that you do. So much so that we're having webinars that'll be posted on our website that you could go to that rems.edu.gov website, and you can have a look at these webinars that talk about specifically each of the closer looks. Talking about information sharing, this is where we discuss, an overview of the FERPA agreement. We talk about the HIPAA and these acts and these laws and these regulations that encompass them. Just like when you go through this guide, we don't really expect you to become an emergency manager specialist. Just by looking at that closer look, we don't expect you to become a FERPA expert or a HIPAA expert. But it is what it is. It is a closer look at this, these acts, these regulations, and help you to better understand and apply them to that emergency operations setting. Of course, psychological first aid for schools, which very important as far as dealing with that recovery phase and talking about issues as far as, the trauma related to that distress and that impact that it has, long term, not just physically and emotionally, but, of course, academically. And there's various resources, and this section will also point towards that. Now, spend a little time on this, and I know I'm running a little bit over, but I think this is the one that most of our audience is really interested in, and one I sort of hashed out a little bit more, talking about close look for climate. And we're talking about that this learning and well-being, it's going to include that safety aspect to it, that the child feels safe, and whatever that definition rings in that child's mind, and that's all psyche, what does it mean to be safe? Talking about the relationships and engagement that that student, that person has in that school, and the actual environment that that student, that person is in. We know that if you provide a positive school environment, you not only promote that sense of well-being and that sense of safeness, but you also see diminishing acts of violence and bullying, harassment, and substance abuse. And not only do you also tend to see, but you also tend to see a cooperation between, if I see violence, I'll report it or I'll talk about it. If I see bullying, I'll intervene. And you'll see that the greater, I don't know if I should say that, but the greater the positive school climate is, the less these other aspects are. Positive school climate also, they feature environments that include that appropriate facility and surroundings, so it's conducive to feeling safe, that the academic settings are supportive, that, and this is really important because also being a prior principal and a dean of students, is that the disciplinary procedures are not only fair, because we write them with considering fairness, but that they're clear, that they're communicated, that they're not convoluted in the way they're trying to say things. And that we're talking about that the environment should be inclusive, be respectful and trusting and caring, and that you have these supports, that you're not just saying it, that these supports for social, emotional, and behavioral exist, that it's not just verbiage. It's you're there to offer that not necessarily that counseling, just that listening to an intervention. Also, research we have seen that by improving this positive environment, and I guess I'm preaching to the choir, but improving this positive environment, you're going to see a boost in student achievement. You're going to see a higher graduation rates. You're going to see a decrease in teacher turnover, or what we call compassion fatigue. You're going to see a decrease in that. You're going to see a decrease in sort of teachers that burn out, that and conversely, which is nice that they write there, it's an increase in teacher satisfaction, a job well done, and I get acknowledged for what I'm doing. And this is turning, we see this in turning around low-performing schools, that one of the things that they do best is improving the school environment. And yes, the academic is also important, but this actually assists and helps that happen. Also, you enhance the safety of the community. And that's something that we tend to forget sometimes, but it does happen, because that positive school, that positive environment is itself inside another environment, another community. And if that school is preaching and practicing and nurturing a positive environment, it actually increases that communication with everybody that's involved with it, which means that that effect of communication, of cooperation, also goes to the surroundings. And you'll see that how this relates to the emergency is that it actually makes you more resilient, and it actually assists and speeds up that recovery process. And not only that, it facilitates the participation of your community in response to your various emergencies. Moving on. And we're talking about how we can break this up. Well, prevention, to the 5 missions, we're talking about it reduces the incidence. It increases the likelihood we can report, and this is actually related to some studies. There's a study, Department of Ed, Secret Service, bystander study that's available, and it actually talks about this. It's one of those key findings. Response, it teaches the social emotional competencies and what's expected behavior, and helps and assists staff in developing these things. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, it's recovery. It assists in that resiliency and the commitment and to sort of support those mental and health services. So what are the steps? What steps could we include to sort of promote this positive climate? Well, the first thing, as following sort of the guidelines that we've established in the guides, is like you need an assessment, because you need to base this on data, not on perceptions. So conduct that climate assessment and get your data. And then use a multi-tiered intervention, not just one simple answer for everybody, but sort of like different answers and responses to different groups of students and personnel and stakeholders. And by doing so, you'll actually be able to sort of address the most need with the most effort, and vice versa. And of course, you're going to promote social emotional competencies. And this, helps individuals, and as it says, prepare for and respond to emergencies. The next one, closer look we talk about, is active shooter situations. Various opinions on this, and even the agencies that supported the guide sort of had different opinions and facts and stuff about this. But it basically is following the same guides that we're talking about, as far as addressing the hazard, as far as as far as the definitions and the common language. So we do talk about, active shooter situations, which we define in the guide as actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a confined and populated area. And that's something that we does get a lot of news, but we tend to not talk about because it is unfortunate. It is something that we don't really want to consider, but that you do need to discuss and you do need to communicate with. So as far as the planning situation, this is something that you start from the beginning process, and these have to be really by the assessments that you do. This has to go through your planning process and ongoing, because it is definitely one that you don't do once and shelf. You want to share your information with your first responders, what you're going to do inside this certain situation, because they're going to be the ones on the scene, probably sometimes even quicker than law enforcement. So what are they expected to do, what is expected to happen, and keep them up to date as far as these things change and you continue to revisit. Exercise, again, we emphasize that the more exercise you do, the more routine it becomes, the more you switch from a reaction to a response. And, to do so is actually, it would be to the level appropriate that you believe your school can handle, your locality. That's a decision that you should really communicate and talk about. Since there is no profile, it's basically what research has pointed out to is that you're talking about behaviors and looking and this behavior, and make sure that you see what's happening around you. And it again goes back to what we just mentioned with the other closer look about the school climate, that if you do have this positive climate and you do have this nurturing environment, you will see more kids stepping up and talking and concerned about, a fellow student who could be possibly going through some things and, exhibiting some signs, some behaviors that are probably not what he used to be doing before. And you'll see more participation of that with a greater increase in your positive environment. The Secret Service, and this is what I mentioned to you earlier. Again, this is in the guides, and you can totally completely look at this at your leisure. And then, of course, the creation of threat assessment teams, which is sometimes it's even the same planning team. Sometimes if you're at a bigger school, it could be somebody else, but they do need to be talking to each other because those two things do go together. And to help, establish and sort of what are we going to do? What are we going to plan? How are we going to share? And all these things. And it's good, a good solid suggestion that this should be associated with a specific team. And how do you respond? I mean, you need to we suggest that you include this in your EOP as that course of action, as what's going to happen, as maybe utilizing some of the aspects of your functional annexes to sort of, to teach and what are you going to do as far as shelter in place, lockdown, evacuate, but also to incorporate this as part of your recovery, as part of your communications. How do you deal with that loss of life? How do you deal with those issues as they come up? And it's better to have those incorporated into your plan now as opposed to just reacting when it happens for the first time. One of the things that we suggest, one of the federal partners also suggested strongly, is that immediate response. It's to respond. This is probably one of the major points that you need to discuss and communicate amongst your team, amongst your community partners, of what this actually means, of what does it mean to say respond immediately, so everybody knows what your expected behavior is going to be. It was proposed by one of our federal partners of certain, about once you recognize this danger, one of the suggestions is that we use the run, hide, and fight criteria. Let me go back. And I think this is one of the points. Of course, you're going to get various opinions across the board through education, across the board through law enforcement, et cetera. But I think this is one of the good points where we talked about way back in the beginning about decision points, and that you need to identify these decision points before you actually start talking about, calls of action and action procedures. So this is a clear example of that. This is something that you need to discuss, teach, and train about. If you're going to use this method, then this is a decision point. This is an analysis that has to happen in order for somebody to respond appropriately. And they each have their own criteria, and they each talk about certain aspects that they do. And when we look at the fight, and this would be as a last resort, as I hit that decision point, I hit that decision process, I communicated it, and I've discussed it before, and when I hit that point as a final, possibly a final solution or as a, last resort, then I could probably face it. Again, very depends on your local, philosophy, your local area and what you guys feel is necessary, but emphasize the point that this does need to be discussed. You can't have some people thinking one thing, some people thinking another. Everybody has to be on the same page, and everybody has to know the whys and what fors and what's the purpose and the why we do what we're going to be doing. Okay? We also have interacting with first responders. How are they going to expect to, during an active shooter situation, what do they expect to do? What do other people know that they're going to do? And of course, afterwards. You can activate all those functional annexes like communications and warnings and reunification with your parents and students. So a lot of these things have to be discussed beforehand. I went a little bit over, so we probably won't have a lot of time for questions, but I really appreciate for those of you that stayed around, and I'm going to try to go through some questions here. And thank you for staying and listening. And as we all know, we all feel this is really important, but this is not an end. This is a process that you go through, that we will continue to go through and continue to keep revising. And I feel you do that as well. I have a question. Says, will this plan be integrated in the school safety plan? I guess that depends on your locality, on your state or your district requirements. But we're thinking that this EOP is that all-encompassing, because we are talking all hazards plan. So it is all-encompassing. So you could actually make the safety plan actually even part of you can incorporate it into it. And again, that would be just my suggestion, but there is no as far as requirement. And that's one thing key, and actually that's a good synaptic connection for that question, that this guide does not establish requirements. This guide does not, restrictions, or it doesn't even authorize certain people to do things. This is sort of our suggested way to come up with a high quality, comprehensive